So here's today's question. Is this day 30 years ago the greatest release day in the history of music? I think it has a good argument. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the albums that defined their era, how many of them were released today, and then everything to do with this time in music 30 years ago and how special it was and its reach and influence and impact here 30 years later on music and on pop culture. So we start with the biggest one. What was the biggest release today? Well, it was the biggest release of its entire era, and that would be, of course, Nirvana's Nevermind. Came out September 24th, 1991. Changed music forever. Nirvana was already established. The so-called grunge Seattle scene had been established for about 7-8 years at that point. But this was what made them go from underground, alternative rock music to the mainstream, hitting bigger than Kurt Cobain or any of his peers or any of his allies in the music scene, anybody at Sub Pop Records, anybody in the other major bands in Seattle ever could have imagined possible. Nobody expected it to happen the way it did. Very exciting time for music. But on that same day, this is crazy as far as I'm concerned, I'm just going to read them off so I don't forget one because it's that many. We have the Red Hot Chili Peppers' landmark Blood Sugar Sex Magik album. We have the Pixies Trompe Le Monde, their last album prior to their hiatus that lasted for over 20 years until they reunited about 8 years ago. A Tribe Called Quest, landmark hip-hop release, The Low End Theory. And then my personal favorite from this day, Soundgarden's Badmotorfinger, which didn't propel them to the same level as Nirvana and eventually Pearl Jam ascended to, but it did set the stage. It laid the groundwork for what would happen for all of Seattle and their later release, 3 years later, with Super Unknown, which is ultimately considered their classic. But Badmotorfinger, some would argue it's better. I would say it's at least in competition with Super Unknown. So let's talk about each one. Which one is best? Which one? That's impossible. I could do a ranking thing for you, but that's not the point of this today. The point is to recognize that the music scene in 1991 experienced a profound change. Something I'm not quite sure we've seen in such a way ever since. Everything that's happened since has been influenced, of course, by the internet and technology in general, and by various different changes in pop culture. 9/11, both wars in Iraq, both in 91, the same year, and then, of course, in 2003, post 9/11. All that stuff had an impact. The changes in politics, the changes in dynamics of everything. Film, of course, had an impact, but this time in music in 1991, especially this fall period, is unparalleled in how quick and seismic of a change it was. Even the 60s, even the back half of the 60s was a more gradual change. This went from literally, Nevermind knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous off of the top of the Billboard 200 charts. That is the most symbolic thing you can imagine. We go from 80s pop to this new thing that wasn't really new, but it felt new to kids like me and the American public, which is grunge or alternative rock, basically stuff that sounded, it had melody. Kurt's favorite band was ultimately the Beatles. It had melody, but it was heavier, it was more dissonant, and it had an anger and an edge and an angular thing to it that you could only find underground on college rock or independent rock radio in the 80s. So it came out of that scene, of course. It was a result of all the things that came before it. Especially punk music for one, and then all the college rock or indie bands, especially like REM, bands like that from the 80s. Certainly the aforementioned Pixies had a huge influence. Kurt was a giant Pixies fan. We had Sonic Youth, we had Jane's Addiction, we had the edge of what was the popular rock music in the late 80s. We had them, that some of them still had something to do with rock and roll and less to do with hair and pop and makeup. And that was stuff like Guns N' Roses. And then in 1990, the year before this, we had the Black Crowes with Shake Your Money Maker, their incredible classic debut album. So you had rock and roll going on, but it was still stuff like Warrant, Great White, a lot of bands that it's easy to laugh at now. I get why they were popular at the time, but the point is how much of a change it was. Michael Jackson is easily one of the greatest artists of all time. Maybe the greatest triple threat single entertainer of all time. Quadruple threat if you count his classical compositions. But the change from Michael Jackson to Nirvana represented a different aesthetic. It represented a different mindset, especially among youth. And the way it blew up and the quickness of it, the speed it blew up is incredible. So you go through all this and you realize that these things don't happen by accident. People were either angry or frustrated or bored or annoyed with what was going on in music. They sought something new. Somehow, magically, guys like Kurt Cobain tapped into that need by happenstance. He didn't do it on purpose. He never wanted to be that famous. None of those guys wanted to be as big as they ended up being, but it happened. And why did it happen? Well, I mentioned earlier, as hard-edged and heavy and intense as some of this music is, it has great melodies. And that is still, it's always been the main reason why people are attracted to music. Melody comes first. Whether you think of it consciously or not, it is the reason why you want to hear what you want to hear. It's the number one thing that draws us in. It's that thing that's difficult to define. It's instinctual. When human being, I've watched it with my daughter. She's almost 5 years old. I've watched it since she was an infant. When human beings hear a melody that does something to them, it's what we respond to. We don't even know what it's doing or why it's doing it. They've explained, I've read some things that explain the science around it, but it's more ethereal, it's more spiritual, it's more emotional than we can really wrap our brains around and do it any justice, at least. Some scientists might be able to explain what's happening in your brain waves, but it doesn't matter because it still doesn't do justice to the way it feels. So here's why. Smells Like Teen Spirit, of course, has that iconic drum fill from Dave Grohl that opens it up, but what really gets people locked in is the lilting melody. It's the way. It's that thing. I don't even know what it is, but it felt good just humming it for you, even though I missed it slightly. Smells Like Teen Spirit has that. And it has the refrain. It's a melody thing. Same thing goes for Come As You Are. Lithium, In Bloom. These songs were the big radio hits off that album, of course. Smells Like Teen Spirit was the one that changed MTV forever. If you go to Badmotorfinger, Soundgarden, much heavier, much weirder album comparatively. Nevermind was probably a little glossier, more produced, a little more mainstream because it came more out of punk, whereas Soundgarden, with some punk influence, came more out of progressive rock and straight hard metal. It had weird time signature changes, but still, you boil it down to what brings you in, and it's Chris Cornell's voice singing those melodies. When you hear him singing Rusty Cage or Outshined or any of those songs, what's happening is the emotional response to the way that beautiful, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest voice of his time, the way it sang those melodies, it brings you in. Regardless of how scientifically just mind-boggling, impossible sounding Matt Cameron's drumming is, and their time signature changes are, it's still the melody that draws you in. I could say the same thing on the hip-hop side. If I talk about De La Soul, if I talk about The Tribe Called Quest, same thing. So that's really what it's about. Why did the Chili Peppers blow up the way they did with Blood Sugar Sex Magik? Under the Bridge. What is Under the Bridge's biggest component that draws you in? It's its melody. Doesn't have anything miraculous going on musically in terms of the instrumental performances, but melodically everybody sings along with that song. And to this day, even though it's been played to death, you feel something when you hear Under the Bridge. The lyrics also, of course, have a lot to do with it, but the melody comes first. And Kiedis knew that, or knows that, Cobain knew that, Cornell knew that, they all knew that. So one more time, going back through it, this day, Nevermind, Blood Sugar Sex Magik, Trompe Le Monde, The Low End Theory, Badmotorfinger, that came after 6 weeks of Metallica's The Black Album, Pearl Jam's 10, their debut, of course, Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, not to mention the rest of the year. The rest of the year is almost as incredible as just those 6 weeks. The rest of the year included, let me just go through a little bit, some examples of how crazy this year was. We had De La Soul is Dead. We had R.E.M's Out of Time, which of course is what turned them into superstars with Losing My Religion. They were getting big, but they shot to the stratosphere with that one. We had U2, Achtung Baby. A lot of people thought they were a one-trick pony in the 80s because it's not too samey, but there's an anthemic quality to most of their music in the 80s. Achtung Baby took a left turn, went all weird, got electronic, got experimental, a lot of dance music, a lot of weird stuff there. So, My Bloody Valentine, Loveless, just an incredible year for music. What was in the water? What was going on that changed music forever? And what's its impact today? Well, a lot of bands wouldn't exist without those. without all those albums and all these artists and this collective time for what made music great in the fall, especially, of 1991. Changed my life forever. I know a lot of people that I'm close with, it changed theirs forever as well. It certainly changed the entire trajectory of music and of pop culture, and we wouldn't be here today where we are with what we know and what's famous. We wouldn't see 12-year-olds rocking Nirvana shirts today, which you do just about anywhere you go with a big crowd of people, without this. It invaded the zeitgeist, took over, and changed everything forever. I want you guys to think about why. Tell me why. I want to hear, I want to understand what happened, and I'm going to make a separate video on the impact and the influence and what has happened as a result of this. Good, and then some, yes, admittedly bad that came from this. But man, I feel lucky to have been alive in the fall of 1991 and to be a kid that was on the verge of pre-adolescence and exposed to all this weird, heavy, intense, beautiful, beautiful music. What a time to be alive. It'd be great if we could have another little renaissance, little wave of this again. So if you like this, comment, please. I want to have discussions about this. There's very little I love more in this world than discussing things like this in music. So I'd love to hear from you. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share it if you think people want to discuss this kind of thing. It's an awesome day for music. I'm going to share a video I made, or a playlist I made on Spotify featuring all this stuff. Put it on shuffle and experience how new and awesome it still sounds 3 full decades later. It's hard to believe, but happy birthday to all these classic albums. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.